Greetings all, I'm Dudley, aka Gunner, because I was a chief warrant officer in the Marine Corps, and this is my channel, Gunner's Range. Now, don't make the mistake of referring to me as a gunny, because in the Marine Corps, gunnies are senior enlisted, and if they find out or think that I'm impersonating them, they will come and kick my butt. So just remember, Gunner, not gunny. Today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the way the Ukrainians are fighting the war against the Russians. But I want to fill in the backstory because that's what really makes this interesting. Now, if you want to really understand how the Ukrainians are fighting the war and their doctrine, it actually needs to go back to the 1920s and 30s in the former Soviet Union. There was a general officer named Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Sadly for the general, he was purged in 1937 by Stalin, and of course purging means that they put a bullet in your head. Now, although there's no real proof as such out there, it is generally believed that Tukhachevsky was responsible for developing the former Soviet Union military doctrine called deep battle. I say called deep battle, I think there was another term for it, but generally speaking, it's recognized as deep battle. Now, Tukhachevsky and others realized that fighting a war, you have to do more than just fight at the line. And he began to develop the doctrine of fighting deep behind the enemy's line. Things like using paratroopers, attacking deep logistics, command centers, things of that nature. Unfortunately for the Soviet Union, Stalin chose to purge Tukhachevsky along with many others, and had he not done so, Germany, I believe, would have had a much harder time in 1941 than they did. One of the reasons given as why Tukhachevsky was purged by Stalin had to do with the fact that Tukhachevsky was fighting in Poland around the time of the 20s and the Winter War. Well, not the Winter War, but there was a war with Poland in the 20s. Tukhachevsky lost a battle to the Poles, and he blamed Stalin for it. Well, you know, what goes around comes around. Now, you can argue based on the historical results. The reasons the Germans did as well as they did at the beginning of the war was because of the purge. Their command structure was in disarray after the purge by Stalin. They were throwing general officers in based on political beliefs and not actual ability. And it showed when the Germans came across the line in 41. Interestingly enough, one general officer, a marshal, who became a marshal, survived the purge, and that was Georgy Zhukov. The reason he was fortunate enough to survive the purge was he was fighting the Japanese in Manchuria at the time, and actually ended up winning a large battle at Khalkhin Gol, which led to the Japanese and Russians signing a non-aggression treaty against each other. Now, Zhukov, as it turns out, was kind of a student of Tukhachevsky's, and so when the war started, he was brought back from the Far East, and he immediately showed why he was as great as he was. Now, to Stalin's credit, I guess you could say that, apparently he realized that he had made a mistake or messed up with his purge. So what he did was he went to Siberia and he emptied the jails of all the Soviet general officers who had been jailed, who had been students of Tukhachevsky and his doctrine. Now, one of these general officers was a guy named Rokossovsky. And Rokossovsky went on to become a marshal. He was front commander, as Zhukov was. And in fact, in Berlin, towards the end of the war, there were two fronts trying to see who'd get to Berlin first. One was commanded by Zhukov, the other by Rokossovsky. As it turns out, Rokossovsky won and got there first. So at this point, I guess you're thinking to yourself, what's this got to do with anything? Well, actually a lot. After the war ended, the Soviets, as a result of deep battle theory, were really good by the end of the war. Now, I will say this, based on things I've seen and read and studies, the U.S. Army was actually just as good and probably even better in some respects than the Soviets were. But there's no question that the Soviets' use of deep battle theory was a very large reason they ended up doing as well as they did in the war. So again, the question is, what does it have to do with anything? Well, a lot. After the war, what did we end up with? The Cold War. And at that time, the Soviets, of course, were considered a threat to the world, and you had the Iron Curtain come up. And there was a big fear because you have the group of Soviet forces in Germany and East Germany, that the Soviets could launch an attack into the West at any time. So getting into the 60s and 70s, of course, the U.S. was embroiled in Vietnam. And many of the officers who later became career officers who had served in Vietnam and seen what a mess it was, swore that they wouldn't let it happen again. And to their credit, they followed through with it. In the late 70s, getting into the 80s, the U.S. realized, well, we still got the Soviet Union to worry about in Germany. So these officers who had fought in Vietnam, they decided, as they rose in rank, they started coming up with ideas for military doctrine specifically to fight the Soviet Union. Now, this doctrine, as it turned out, came to be known as air-land battle. And one of the things it did was to emphasize the deep war, the war beyond the line, the war to attack nodes of communication, headquarters, logistics, ammunition, all these things. And as it turned out, the results of air-land battle was what happened in Desert Storm. Now, it's true the U.S. would have won, but the coalition forces would have won anyway. But the reason we won as quickly as we did, and I was there, was the fact that we had, as they say, prepared the battlefield, spent a lot of effort bombing, going after, the Iraqis, logistics, command nodes, things of that nature, transportation, the stuff that would inhibit the Iraqis when we came across. And clearly it did. So, fast forwarding into the same year, 91, the Soviet Union breaks up. Ukraine immediately declares independence. Now, as it turned out at that time, the head of the Ukrainian military, I guess you'd say their chief of staff, was a retired former Soviet Union general officer. Now, to his credit, he approached Western officers, I guess, if you want to say that. At one, I know I've heard Ben Hodges was one. And I forgot the name of this gentleman, but basically he made a decision that Ukraine would train their new military using Western doctrine. And he proceeded to do that. So while things were looking quiet, things seemed that way for years, where nothing was going on, the Ukrainian military was steadily learning and being trained in Western doctrine. And in 2014, when the Soviets annexed Crimea, the Ukrainian military wasn't ready because they were small. And it was a matter of equipment, things of that nature. But still, Ukrainians fought successfully, at least in keeping the situation in Donetsk going any further than it did. Okay, so fast forward to 2022, and you see what's happened. Russians come across, and they immediately get bogged down. And if you go back and look at videos, you know, news reports of things that, you'll see newspaper reporters with videos following like a 3 or 4 man Ukrainian army team sneaking around in the woods, and one of them's carrying a javelin. And undoubtedly what happened was that company commander looked at Sergeant Ivanov and said, hey, take your fire team going out there and knock out a tank for us. So they did. Ukrainians had recognized the value of having the NCO, the one who knows what's going on the ground, of being able to make independent decisions. And that is why year 3 will come to an end in February, and the Russians are no closer to winning this war than they were at the beginning. And I believe I've said in other videos that I've done previous to this, that I said at the beginning, the Russians could not beat Ukraine. And the reasons are very simple. The Russians have no professional NCO corps. Junior officers are not allowed to make decisions. That's all funneled into what's going on now. But let's fast forward a little again. As the Ukrainians began to receive more and more Western weapons, what did they start doing? They started going deep. Air-land battle. Started attacking transportation hubs, oil refineries, ammunition, that thing. And you can see now, it started small because they didn't have a lot of equipment up front. But now you can see from their drone warfare, they understand deep battle. They understand air-land battle, and they are prosecuting their war with Russia using air-land battle, and they are doing it in a most excellent manner. The Ukrainian military needs to be congratulated because they have shown they learned their lessons well. And look what's happened. I mean, the Russians, they're in trouble. No matter what they say, no matter any disinformation you see out there, the Russians are in trouble. If they weren't, they wouldn't, for one thing, they wouldn't be bringing North Korean soldiers in to try and help, which even the Russian soldiers don't like. So be that as it may, the point is Ukraine learned their lessons, and they are applying those lessons every day. And I don't care what anyone says. The Russians may end up with some land, but Ukraine is winning this war. There's no question about it. Okay, with that, I'm going to say Semper Fi. And as a matter of fact, today is November 5th. The birthday is going to be on Sunday, and I'll be out celebrating with all other Marines, I think, starting on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Semper Fi, happy birthday to all you Marines out there. I'm Gunner. I'm out.